So what I started doing a few years ago was pulling government data. We started to see, well, you've got all this information and data about us and around us. And if that data is right, then why is it the policies and programs that are coming out are actually quite destructive in terms of our own health and well-being? And so I started pulling that data to get a better handle on what it was government were doing with it, and realised that when you have hold of that data, you can create whatever story or narrative you want to support your worldview, not anyone else's, right? And that's a fact. So we can see it. And so that ended up in a project where we built a tech platform to pull government data, local government data, iwi data, you name it. And so what we got into was a space around health and well-being. We could see into hospitals and patient data. We couldn't see the patients. It was all contracted work through hospitals and ministry and DHBs, so it was safe. But we could start to work things out that the hospitals weren't even looking at, i.e. what's actually going on if we drill down into our communities, into our whānau, the streets. There's 5 streets. Most of the kids that are clogging up a hospital, the one hospital with getting tooth extraction between the ages of 4 to 9 come out of a handful of streets. Who's talking to those communities, right? No one on this issue. So we ran all these things and looked at, we did projects around environmental land use impacts on fresh water. And that opened up a whole other can of worms for us in terms of a local government consenting RMA land practice perspective. But it was actually standing out. We were doing a project with Ministry for the Environment about 3 years ago, and we did really get to see firsthand where some of the policy blockers were in terms of solving some of this stuff. But it was standing out in this paddock after about probably 14 years of working in the iwi Māori economic development space, which again gets us into health and housing and education and economics and all that sort of stuff. In this paddock here, when I stood there, and we'd met with a whole bunch of farmers, interviewed a lot of farmers in mainstream conventional farming systems who were under severe stress, huge pressure economically, health and well-being, mental health wasn't flash. And I phoned this guy here who I'd known for a number of years. He used to coach my son in footy, and I knew that he was advising and coaching farmers who had moved to regenerative and organic farming. He was a dairy farmer, and I said, this is a train wreck, that what we're seeing. And I grew up on my milking cows on my uncle's farm in Hauraki. And I just couldn't believe what we were seeing. So anyway, we went out, and this guy took us around to some of his farmers. And we literally saw 2 different universes. We saw high stress economics melting down, and we saw pretty low stress, and an indicator that we've started to talk about more is joy. Right? It does the scientists' heads in when we say a legit indicator for this farming practice is joy. They say you can't measure that. Well, you can, because go and talk to these guys, and they will explain to you what joy looks like or what it means to them. Not what we think it is, but what they think it is. But as you can see here, and Stan, this is, the true, someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, the human species has really destroyed this planet. And my response to that was, no, some of our human species are doing their best to destroy this planet. There's some who still get it, who are still connected, who are doing the very best they can to make sure that their farming practices are creating healthy food for their whānau communities and consumers, are creating a healthy soil environment, pasture environment for the animals. Now we're starting to see getting more productivity out of their animals because the animals are healthier. They're going to provide more for you. So the true heroes and the species, the part of the slice of human species that isn't trying to do their best to stuff this thing up are the people who are practicing the sorts of regenerative and organics, agriculture and horticulture practices that we're seeing more and more of now. So this is in the central South Island. So before I move on, I'll just show you, and you would have seen yesterday, these are our solar panels here. You see the size of these leaves? So those big solar panels right now, in my 101 science lesson is, they're taking the sun's energy and CO2 and drawing it down into the soil and converting that into sugars. So now we're getting energy into the soil and the system. The other thing about those big leaves and those grasses is that they've got much deeper root systems. So your root structure goes down further into the soil, and so now it's drawing water and CO2 and a whole bunch of other nutrients further down and back up out of the soil. So you get this whole ecology working in balance the way it's supposed to be. So essentially they're brought back into balance, the the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, and the carbon cycle. Now, have a think about this for a minute. Imagine if you wanted to convert back to conventional farming after running this kind of system, right? So what would you do? You'd come in and you'd bomb it with Roundup to wipe all that, seriously, wipe all that out, right? Get rid of it, bomb it with Roundup. Once that's gone, you may come in and just till it all and turn everything over and kind of get this and disrupt the soil and the system underneath. And then you're going to come in and plant probably 2 types of grasses, ryegrass and clover. Now have a think about ryegrass as a solar panel and compare that solar panel with these solar panels. And then compare in a kind of non-scientific way how much sequestration, how much drawdown of water and carbon is going on when you shift to that model. And the other key thing to think about that is that then you go and put animals on and you graze it right down to nothing. So now you're down that deep. So rough rule of thumb, the grass on top of the ground is going to replicate roughly the root zone underneath the soil, right? So here you've got root zone that looks like this, and it's got fungi and bacteria and microbial activities going on, and you get energy back into it, versus root system that's kind of that deep and there's a little bit of not much going on. So now you've moved from soil to dirt, dirt's inert, soil's alive. Now think about the dominant New Zealand agriculture system, right? So we've created this kind of industrialized agricultural model that I think is showing up today in balance sheets and profit and loss accounts. Banks are freaking out because the model that they've invested in from a capital and debt perspective is in free fall. And so we've got some pretty serious problems in our farming community right now. So then when we talk about taking a data-driven approach to starting to understand this is one of our platforms called Takiwā. I'll go through quickly. We've been working with Te Arawa River Iwi Trust, taking regional council data, tribal data, sites of cultural significance, data off the river around water quality. So here's the Ruahua catchment, this spot in here, and that's the Waikato River coming up through here. There's Lake Taupo down there. We've got vital stats on the lakes up here, lake water quality data from a national project that we've been working on for about 4 years now called the Lake Ecosystems Research New Zealand project. We can see basic data like topography and this stuff here, which is all your consents for water allocation, and I'll show you what over allocation looks like shortly, but there's a huge amount of consents in there. And this data here we're dropping into now on the side of the river here, that's the Waikato River up the top, so it's pretty pristine looking water coming in here, although there's high levels of phosphate. We can get the data on these farms, and what we get to see is there's 93 tonnes of nitrogen of urea going on that farm on the side of the river a year. So now what we've got here is these are Waikato Regional Council monitoring sites. So once a month someone goes out and takes a lab sample, they rush it back to the lab, take a test and try and work out what's going on that river. Of course, once a month with a lab sample like that, you've got no idea what's going on that river, right? How are you ever going to know? That's Māori freehold land, by the way, those blue things in there. So we're working with some of them at the moment to say, what does a conversion to regenerative agriculture, regenerative organics look like? Just to get to a zero synthetic nitrogen input and a zero chemical input model. Okay, so in here what we've done is we've gone and put 3 sensors in. They're lab quality sensors, so we're getting nitrate and nitrite, amongst other things, in real time 24/7. You know, when you go through, get your bag swabbed, I don't know if any of you have, I certainly have, at the airports, and then they stick it into the machine, they're looking for parts per billion of traces of nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, phosphorus, and all the things that pollute our rivers. So the guys who built that and have been selling those into airports around the world have converted some into these water sensors. So when it's now lab quality, and so so here's your once a month regional council sites, here's our real-time sensors. So we're getting this stuff. Well, what we can see is about 3 o'clock in the morning is when we can see our highest levels of nitrate during the daytime. sun comes out, photosynthesis, algae starts eating, numbing eats all the nitrogen, algae and weeds grow, and the nitrate drops off, and then at night it comes back up again. And that's what it looks like, right? So that's quite different to a once a month sample. That's every 15 minutes, night and day. And that's the same again. Oh, so there's a comparison. When you go on to look for the data on this, there's our data that we've been using. Here's Waikato Regional Council's data. It's a picture of a bridge. Okay, so quickly, nitrogen. You may be aware of what's going on down south right now with the train wreck around the Canterbury Rohe. Nitrogen levels have shot well past World Health Authority safe limits. It's in the drinking water in the kitchens. That's Lake Te Waihora. That's got one of the highest nitrogen nutrient rates in the country, and you can see the water catchment in the yellow around the outside. And there's your water consent allocation. We can drill into all the numbers on each one of those points too to see how much and out to how when. A lot of this is consented out to 2040, 2030, 2040, so that horse is bolted. So imagine now you've got all that nitrogen going on top, you've got all that irrigation going on. There's only there's a couple of places that disaster is going to end up in, mostly in this lake here. So that lake's toast at the moment. But the cool thing about this, and back to Walter's thing, that there's hope, is that there's a farmer in here, there's actually a bunch of them, but we've been working with this guy. He's putting zero nitrogen on his farm. He's been running organics for about 10 years now. He's getting some pretty amazing results. Now, the science community will tell us that we cannot attribute what he's doing to any impact that he might be having on the waterways, right? The easiest way for us to avoid getting into a debate like that is don't engage, right, on attribution. Why would we engage on a conversation around attribution in a dominant, reductive scientific domain, right, when we can have wider ranging debates around holistic kind of views to ecology and ecosystems and all of that, and trust the observations that our farmers are making are way more valuable to us than the lack of evidence to support something like a regenerative organics model. So that's a one-page overview report. We don't know, I mean, this has all been locked up, and obviously the fertilizer companies own the tool, so you can't see what drives the engineering and the... Well, have a look at the companies register. They sold out, so they used to be a part owner, AgResearch. They bailed. They still got a tiny wee stake. Here's the number we're most interested in. Zero nitrogen fertilizer going in. So when you think about how do we measure outcomes, and we're all for measuring outcomes and the results, but also let's not ignore inputs and the importance of inputs when you've got a paradigm that thinks about this in a different way. What actions are we taking every day that's going to give us better results? That's not a scientific action or number. That's the reality of a farmer getting up out of bed every morning saying, today I choose to do this on my farm and not that. And so that's it really. I mean, I'll give you one last kind of story around what we're up against here, because it's the stands and other whānau around the country right now who are about to change the game. But if you think about it, how deep this challenge is, and how we need to find ways to bust through it, who we need to engage with and who we need to disengage with. How do we wake people up and grow some consciousness around this? If you think about it right now, the government's legislated for the co-governance group between the Crown and River iwi on the Waikato River to say you've got this time frame and this pūtea to solve this river, right? Because the river's a mess. And while those groups are trying to allocate funding and resources out to projects to solve for the river, and you see by the lack of information that the councils are collecting on what the point source of nutrient inflows look like, when it's doable. Why? Because we're doing it. So you see how a council's flying blind. Within that region, you've got a legislated co-governance group trying to clean the river up, right? And then you jump on to see, we've got the data in here too, where the regional council's flying helicopters directly over the river spraying metsulfurin to kill alligator weed and algae. Metsulfurin is an ecotoxin. It kills the aquatic life in the river. On the warning label, it says, do not clean your equipment near waterways. So now you've got this legislative group going, we need to clean this river, and while they're having those kōrero, you've got helicopters spraying metsulfuron directly into the river. When 75% of our native fish species are on the edge of extinction. And no one in that room knows that this is even an issue. Not because they can't work it out, it's just we don't have the access to the right timely sort of data and information to give us any... Pardon?
They could read the label.
Who's going to read the label? You get into a reductive policy and science worldview, right? The guy flying the helicopter says, I don't know what I'm dropping on it. My job's to fly the helicopter. The dude's loading it going, well, we ought to kill the alligator weed to protect the dairy industry. It says that on the website, right? My job's to kill alligator weed to protect these guys. You go, but what about the fish? Well, that's not my job. Right? So then Mike Joy goes and does the research, bangs the drum, beats everyone up, and he's the baddie for telling everybody. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that because we need Walter to kind of give...
May I just say something? Look, congratulations. This is so important. But what you really said is data is, in a sense, a resource, is power. You have to manage that data on your terms.
Yep.
Here's the data. Now, you brought up two things fundamentally important. The first thing is, you see, the state or industry can neutralise any issue by averaging things. So when you bring it across a whole catchment, you get generic data across the catchment, you actually blot out all the information in that catchment. You blot out any dangers, the real dangerous signals, because that's all averaged out. But much, much worse than that, you blot out the points of excellence.
Yep.
And you can never learn because you can never see the excellence for all the noise, because it's
Yep.
all averaged. And that's where we've been for 50 years in the climate debate. Okay? And so basically, and it's a bit like what Benjamin sort of said, no, we've got to leave all that waffle behind and just focus on the points of excellence. And we've done these studies too in CSIRO, but then we were closed down.
Yep.
Because we had basically disease incidents across populations at the micro levels, and cancers, they just stood out as spikes. And that community, in that habitat, next to that lead smelter, the kids had, lead-based leukemia, which went up through the roof. But basically that was a class action, public liability, and a scandal. So what do? We average the data, close down the CSO Division of Human Nutrition, and now we're just publishing average data across the whole state.
Yep.
We don't have a problem.
Yep.
Now, so you having control of your data is absolutely important because, as you say, you can then say, here are our priorities, but now the positive side on this, right? And this is where the First Nations come in. May I just, for a second, draw something at the door?
Yeah.
By the way, Walter's got sort of compulsive whiteboard.
Yeah, but this is important because you've got a disaster, Canterbury Plains, all that nitro. You see, and you say, hey, this is a disaster, it is. But you turn it around to say, hang on, here is the opportunity. And you go back to the First Nations experience around the world, and you go back to Montezuma, Mexico, and they had a concept called chinampas. And chinampas were very, very simple. They would just have drains, and then they would build their gardens on these raised beds between drains. These are 2 to 3 metres wide, about 1 metre deep. And then they would basically grow aquatic weeds, water hyacinths and what have you. Massive, prolific production. Basically, okay, sugarcane was 200. These guys get up to 500 tonnes per hectare per annum biomass. Aquatic weed, water. And of course they would continually be mulching, and this is where they grew their bananas and pawpaws and avocados, and the whole chinampas. And basically, Cortez Montezuma saw these things in the Mexican lake, and they were absolutely never seen anything so productive. And of course, the first thing as Europeans they had to do, they had to destroy it all, because they were civilized, and how could this civilization have something better? But basically, these things are so productive because they're the things that are harvesting the nitrate and the phosphate from that runoff. So all that nitrate and phosphate is a free resource. And you can grow massive quantities of biomass for compost and biofertilizer and what have you, and actually you can then grow very, very productive, systems. But be careful, because if you try to do that, then all of a sudden, hang on, you're using our free nitrates. You're not paying for these. We've got to legislate against this, because you're using our pollutants for nothing. We've got to somehow levy you for that, or regulate it. But what I'm trying to say is, here is First Nations, Chinampas, here are experiences, those cultures have looked through, have evolved these very innovative systems, and they're sort of available. And see, this is really the license that we have with the data, with the knowledge. How do we redesign our innovations? Not that you have to copy this, but basically, this is harvesting pollutants, preventing them from going into the river, and actually getting them for free. And really, it's a big part of the solution. We have exactly the same thing in central Queensland with our sugar cane, because again, they're putting on 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum to grow the sugar cane. That's killing the Barrier Reef, because we've got the same pollution run off onto the reef. It's basically putting algal blooms, which then smother all the corals and what have you, and just make crown of thorn starfish proliferate. So the question is, can we have these concepts, First Nation concepts, and say, hey, this is now a resource, how do we actually optimise it? But it's only innovators, it's backing that excellence of those innovators rather than that status quo.
Legend. See, I'll tell a story. Walter takes it to a whole nother level, which is epic. So Walter, what I'm interested in is, while you're here, is, if we look at this, you talk a lot about trees, getting trees back into the ground and what that does for water, the hydrological cycle and carbon and so on. But what are your thoughts, and you may have covered it yesterday, and apologies if you did, but what are your thoughts around models like regenerative agriculture? So if we look up in the background, the thinking there is, imagine if that all were put into trees and on our farms and productive areas, we were able to do something with that to kind of recreate or create those stronger hydrological systems. Where does this kind of regen model fit, or regenerative organics model fit, vis-a-vis, say, planting trees?
Well, we keep discussing this, and I keep saying we've got this big area of pasture, in New Zealand, and a relatively small area of forestry. How could we, what are the numbers? And of course, Walter's just giving us numbers that are lower, but it's a much bigger area.
Yeah.
And I'm validating my farming system with the diverse routing.
Yeah.
Stan and I, we're the same.
Yeah.
But also looking at the whole landscape, because there you've got obviously hills, you see, and that's degrading. But how do we build a shelter wood across that that harmonises and really rebuilds that cycle? In reality, we're now facing how exposed, how vulnerable is that if you're now getting drier weather? 2 months, 3 months, 4 months of drought, and how do you build resilience into that? How do you build water cycles that give you stability, buffering, resilience, cooling into the system, which is a challenge now. And we can. Very elegant.
Awesome.
Peter Andrews would have you putting trees on the ridges. And taking the value.
Can you, with this geospatial sort of mapping, how can we measure temperature down to whatever unit you think?
Well, you can have probes in the soil, or we're getting better and better at, in CSIRO have done some groundbreaking work in this space, is satellite data, and there's all different ways now, but we've been working with a lady called Delwyn Moller. Delwyn was over in the States for about 26 years with her family. Remember Lorraine Moller, the runner? Her sister. And Delwyn worked at NASA and Jet Propulsion Lab, and she built radars at NASA. She was an engineer, award-winning engineer over there. She's back in Wanaka now, and so she's been working with us, looking at a hydrology model, doing some hydrology modelling. She's got one of her ex-NASA guys back on it again, and these guys are awesome. But she's just got approval through a project funded by MB and the Space Agency, partnership with Air New Zealand, and they're putting some of these radars underneath ATRs on Air New Zealand's planes. And so we will get that data, soil moisture, crop cover, type of crops, daily from the bottom of those planes.
$12 million that the government spent with the NGO in New York.
I don't think so. I don't know. I doubt it.
I haven't tracked that one down.
This is just a new... I mean, you look at how much money spent on national science challenges and those big projects and what's come out of it, and I've got a funny feeling this one will be underfunded, but we'll get some pretty good results.
Yes.
But will we have access to that data?
Well, I'm imagining we will have access to some or most of it. There'll be some commercial arrangements in place, I'm imagining, with Air New Zealand, but if government's driving it and funding it, then we should be able to get access to that data. The question will be to what degree of confidentiality do you run across that when you can see on top of farms? But we can see on top of it right now with the publicly available space data from NASA.
Peter has a very important point, you see, because here's a new dimension, so how do we get learning, understanding, data on that? And of course, initially you say, oh, do we have to measure, or how do we measure soil temperature everywhere? And that's logical. We really need to whiteboard this and discuss it, because as we work through the idea, hey, we actually don't have to measure temperature at all, we've already got it. Because all we need to do is measure, as we said yesterday, longevity of green. You see, because that relates back to productivity.
That's our satellite data.
But we already do that from space every 8 days, every square hectare of this planet, we've got satellites measuring that. We don't have to measure soil temperature because we've already got re-radiation, infrared radiation. We saw the Stephan-Boltzmann equation, you know, temperature relates to how much heat's coming up. We already measure that, free. That's available on the data. So this is where we really have the power to say, once we know what we need, what are our metrics, what are our criteria to get our data, then we go back to these freely available data sources, longevity of green, you know, re-radiation data, and we can give you a temperature map of that country in very intimate detail, and then pick our points of excellence, and then reinforce, yeah, these innovations do.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
But it's having those discussions, you see, and this is a license in a sense that we've got to, isn't it, Peter, that basically, okay, how do we explore those metrics and the smarts of doing that? And this is a valuable thing to do it.
So this is a venture we're launching tomorrow called Calm the Farm, which is how do we attract impact investment money, people who care, who understand Walter's work and other, there's some amazing people now around this space. You bring it all together, it's like, well, the science exists, so Wellington will tell us that there's not enough evidence to show that this is a thing. Well, that's not true.
I think this is where the discussion is, and then as Benjamin sort of outlined, that allows us to say these are the important things to measure.
Yeah.
Let's focus on those. We can leave a lot of the other. I mean, there's data and data,
Yeah.
lies, and statistics, right? But the point is, these are our data, and then you just stand on your data.
Yep.
To say, here it is. Get on the lifeboat, but if you don't want to if you don't like the lifeboat, it's not the right
Yep.
colour, stay in the water with the white pointers.
Yeah. So this is looking at how we bring farmers who want to make the move together with investors and funders who want to support that move. Let's not get locked up in a policy or science debate. This has got science all the way through it. There was a Endeavour bid went in last year, 15 mil bid on regenerative agriculture, didn't get past the first threshold of science excellence, as deemed by the scientists who were selecting the applicants.